The idea of trying to understand a work of art in terms of larger cultural values or practices might seem pretty obvious. Of course, works of art function in relation to cultural contexts. Indeed, they can even be seen as the products of their cultures in rather specific ways. Consequently, art historians regularly research the social, economic, religious, and linguistic landscapes in which works of art were made and circulated, in the hopes of understanding both the works and the cultures more fully. Broadly speaking, we might call this aspect of art history cultural analysis. Of course, that's not the only way of analyzing a work of art. For example, in looking at the famous Aztec sunstone, which you see here, and which was likely carved during the reign of Moctezuma II in the early 1500s, we might privilege the work's formal elements, noting its general symmetry and its insistent centrality. Or we could perform an iconographic analysis, in which we try to identify the various subjects and symbols and motifs, which include at the very center an apparent image of the sun god Tonatiuh, surrounded by four squares that allude to the four eras preceding the current one in the Aztec calendar. At some point, though, we'll almost certainly also want to think about the meaning of the stone in its cultural context. In what other ways, for instance, did the Aztec notion of time and of cosmic cycles influence this calendar stone? And how might it be related to contemporary notions of, say, political power? As soon as we ask such questions, we're doing a form of cultural analysis. That mode of thinking really took shape in art historical circles in the mid-1800s. Earlier art historians had tended to think in terms of individual artists and distinctive styles. How did a work reflect the hand of its maker? In 1878, though, the Swiss art historian Jakob Burkhardt wrote a really inventive history of Renaissance Italy, in which he attempted to relate the period's art to a variety of cultural practices and institutions. Renaissance paintings and buildings weren't designed in isolation, Burkhardt contended. Rather, they were cultural products, and so they needed to be viewed in relation to the governments that commissioned them, the religious ceremonies that they augmented, and even the philosophical notions that were emerging at the same time. Burkhardt opened the door then to a much more substantial engagement with cultural forms, and other art historians soon began to follow him. One of the most interesting of these was Aby Warburg, who was the elder son in a wealthy Jewish family in Hamburg. He was destined to inherit the family fortune, but by the late 1880s, as a 20-something, he had plunged into the study of art history, and he actually traded his inheritance to his younger brother, who in turn pledged to buy Aby any book that he ever desired. Arguably, Aby got the better end of that deal, as he went on to amass a vast collection of books, sources, and reproductions, which he began to mount on posters in a sort of dynamic, ever-shifting map of artistic patterns and influences across time. Initially, Warburg was primarily interested in ancient and Renaissance art, but in 1895 he traveled all the way to the southwestern United States, spending months visiting Pueblo monuments, observing Hopi and Zuni sites and ceremonies, and interviewing a Hopi priest and his son. Warburg was particularly affected by a traditional dance in which the performers dressed as antelopes, and by the prominence of serpents or snakes in the local mythologies. The Hopi regularly performed a snake dance, in fact, and a drawing that was executed by that Hopi priest who spoke with Warburg included serpents that recalled, to Warburg, streaks of lightning. Years later, he composed a lecture about this trip in which he tried to draw these various elements together, essentially arguing that the local Native American interest in serpents was related to a desire for rain in what was, after all, a very arid part of the country. And he made his case by relating the drawing, the dances, and local religious beliefs in a complex form of cultural analysis. More than half a century later, the art historian Millard Meiss tackled a very different sort of question. Meiss was interested in the Black Death, that devastating outbreak of bubonic plague that decimated Italy in the late 1340s and early 1350s. It killed up to half of the population of some of the peninsula's largest and wealthiest cities. Did the sorts of paintings produced after the plague, Meiss wondered, differ from those produced in the years before it? The answer, he felt, was undeniably yes, pointing to works such as this one, in which a painter named Orcagna represents the central Christ as a grim, severe figure, Meiss discerned a pronouncedly conservative aspect. Orcagna's work seemed to intentionally reject some of the more exciting pictorial developments that had characterized Italian painting in the 1330s and 40s, and to instead have returned to a conservative emphasis on an abstract, timeless heaven and stiff, formal frontal poses. To Meiss, this made sense, as a traumatized Italian public might understandably have had little taste for risk or experimentation, and instead desired an art that accented comfortably archaic formulas. But in order to make that argument clearly, Meiss employed a form of cultural analysis, as you can see in this quote from his book, in which he promises to read the art in relation to religious sentiment, literary thought, and popular psychology. Orcagna's painting, in other words, needed to be seen in terms of a broader context. Meiss's argument didn't convince everyone, but it was extremely influential, and in the years following, an increasing number of art historians began to enthusiastically embrace cultural analysis. Svetlana Alpers, who taught for decades at the University of California, Berkeley, made an important contribution to that cause in 1983 with her book, The Art of Describing, in which she tried to offer a sensitive account of 17th century Dutch visual culture. As you may have noticed from the examples we've already considered, much early art history focused on the Italian Renaissance. Alpers knew that, but she also felt that the result was constricting, that the sorts of ideas that characterized Renaissance Italian art didn't necessarily appear in the work of other cultures. Here's what she was getting at. Italian Renaissance art was often rooted in source texts, including the Bible, and often depicted recognizable figures acting out famous episodes. In this famous fresco by Michelangelo, for instance, we see the creation of Adam by God, an episode that's described in the book of Genesis. It's essentially a literary painting, then. It illustrates an event that's central to Christian theology. But Dutch art, argued Alpers, didn't necessarily have the same basis. Sure, the Dutch also used texts, but when she looked at examples of Dutch visual culture from the 1600s, she was repeatedly struck by an evident fascination with the visual rather than the verbal, and with an almost encyclopedic tendency, as if the goal was to record everything in the world. You could take this map as an example. Yeah, it's a map, but it's saturated with other images as well, with images of ships at sea, and of foreign peoples, and of the city of Holland. And, well, here's how Alpers put it in her book. In Holland, if we look beyond what is normally considered to be art, we find that images proliferate everywhere. They are printed in books, woven into the cloth of tapestries or table linens, painted onto tiles, and of course framed on walls, and everything is pictured, from insects and flowers to Brazilian natives in full life size. The maps printed in Holland describe the world and Europe to itself, she wrote. And so, in other words, if we want to understand Dutch art and visual culture, we need to first understand that the culture's priorities and tastes were fundamentally different from those of Italy, and demanded an art history that was alert to, sensitive to, those differences. Again, this may seem relatively obvious. Of course, works of art reflect and extend the values and interests of the cultures in which they're made. But that doesn't diminish the importance of the idea. And so perhaps it's unsurprising that art historians active today regularly perform versions of cultural analysis in trying to understand works from the past. In 2009, for example, Timon Screech offered a novel analysis of prints made in Edo, Japan, by relating them to the military garrison culture in which they circulated. And in 2017, Kelly Jones drew together the work of a number of inventive African-American artists based in LA in the 1960s by evoking, in an especially fine-grained way, some of the cultural circumstances and touchstones that brought them together and informed their work. Consequently, then, whether you're looking at work from an ancient culture or at a piece made only a few years ago, you might want to consider the potential value of cultural analysis, which has informed art historical work for more than a century and a half, and can aid us in comprehending objects in richer and more multidimensional ways.